All right, well, welcome everyone. Welcome to Straight Science. This is an evening science presentation put on by UAF Alaska Sea Grant, here the home office, and UAF Northwest Campus. Know that UAF Alaska Sea Grant and UAF Northwest Campus, we are public servants and serve the public Strait region, which is the homeland and waters of the Yupik, Inupiaq, and St. Lawrence Island Yupik peoples. We're really excited tonight to learn a little bit more about belugas in Norton Sound. Tonight's speaker is Megan Ferguson, no stranger to NOAA, as you'll soon hear. She is the NOAA research biologist with the cetacean program at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, and she's actually calling from Seattle, so extra bonus credits for that, for calling in on a different time zone. It's already evening for sure for you. With that, we do have a caller, so know that for any of the other audience members, callers have priority at Straight Science because our digital divide is a real thing here in the Bering Strait region. And so as long as the caller can hear it, know that if you cannot unmute our caller and you're listening, you can always text my phone, 907 434-1149 if you're having a trouble getting through, and we will get on that. So with that, let's hear about what happened in June with belugas in Norton Sound. How do we count them and why? Thank you so much. Megan, take it away.
All right, thank you, Gay. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to everyone who is listening in tonight. It is totally fine to ask me questions or make any comments during my talk. I only have one screen, so I can't see the chat, but Gay will be monitoring the chat, so go ahead and put your comments in the chat, or unmute yourself and ask a comment, or make a comment, ask a question. I also have put my email address and my phone number on the title slide here. So if you think about something later on, either a question you want to ask or a comment you want to have, feel free to comment me at either my email or give me a call, and I'm happy to get back to you on that. Okay, so with that, these beluga surveys that I'll be talking about tonight, they're really the latest in a long-term research program that was initiated by the Alaska Beluga Whale Committee. And so tonight, I'm not only going to tell you about belugas and the aerial surveys that we flew this June, I'm also going to give you a little bit of background into the Alaska Beluga Whale Committee and their partnership with NOAA, which is the agency that I work for. So just to set the scene, why do we care about belugas? And when I think about this question, there are three things that come to mind. First, they are an important part of Indigenous subsistence communities, particularly in the Norton Sound and Yukon area. Second, they're an important part of the ecosystems up there. They eat salmon and other fish, they eat crab and other invertebrates, and they're pretty cool. So that's another reason why we care about belugas. And this last one is that they have an inherent value. And what I mean by that is that people, even people who have never seen a beluga before and may never see a beluga, they like the idea that there are healthy beluga populations out there, healthy belugas and healthy oceans. So that's what I mean by inherent value. Okay, I'm going to take each one of these and go into a little bit more detail now, starting with the subsistence aspect. So this slide here shows some photos that show the importance of belugas to Indigenous subsistence communities. So from the entire aspect of the subsistence process, from hunting belugas to harvesting belugas, to processing the meat and the muktuk, to enjoying a meal, these are all opportunities for families and friends to spend time together, to strengthen relationships and build those bonds. And on top of that, beluga is a traditional and healthy food source. So the subsistence aspect is incredibly important. And I also want to remember that to thank the Alaska Beluga Whale Committee for providing a lot of the photos for this presentation. You might notice some of your friends and family in the photos, and if so, I'm glad that you were able to see that. Okay, so we know that subsistence is important. We know that belugas are important. Without an abundance estimate, without knowing how many belugas are out there, it's very difficult to know whether the beluga harvest is sustainable. And at this point, I want to mention that I will use the term abundance and population size interchangeably. They mean the same thing. And what I mean when I talk about abundance or population size is the number of beluga whales in Norton Sound and the Yukon. I will also use the terms population and stock interchangeably. They mean the same thing for the Eastern Bering Sea beluga whales. It means that it is a genetically distinguishable unit. Okay, getting that out of the way. So we have subsistence is important. Abundance estimates are important for a sustainable harvest. The next thing I want to do is I want to introduce you to our study area. So this map here shows where we conducted our surveys. You see Nome at the north. This is all of Norton Sound going down along the coast of the Yukon Delta, and it ends right down here in Hooper Bay. I've placed some little beluga cartoons where belugas are commonly found, but I will show you some maps where we actually saw beluga sightings a little bit later on. So if we want to sustainably harvest belugas, then conservation and management are really important. And conservation and management require knowledge about the past, the present, and the future. Some of the types of questions we ask when we're thinking about conservation and management are, how many belugas are out there now? How many belugas were there in the past? Where are the belugas? What are they doing? What causes them to stay or go? And where will they go next? And how are all these things changing in time? Now, early on, I mentioned the Alaska Beluga Whale Committee, and some of you might be familiar with this, some of you might not. So what is it? And I'll refer to this by the acronym ABWC, and I think this is the only time in my talk when I just use letters and not words. It's a long title, and it's just easier, so I'll refer to it as ABWC. So the ABWC is a co-management group. It was founded in 1988, and its members are representatives from beluga hunting communities, including delegates that are beluga hunters themselves. It also includes scientists and natural resource managers from local, state, federal, and tribal governments. And the ABWC has two main goals. The first is to maintain healthy populations of beluga whales in Alaskan waters. And here we're talking primarily about Western and Northern Alaska. The Cook Inlet beluga whales are not part of ABWC's management priorities. The second goal is to provide for adequate subsistence harvests of beluga whales and protect hunting privileges for Alaskan subsistence hunters. So this all comes from the ABWC management plan. So NOAA and ABWC are partners. In 1999, NOAA signed a co-management agreement with the ABWC. So that formalized this partnership. And NOAA's authority to help with the conservation and management of beluga whales in association with the ABWC comes from the U.S. Marine Mammal Protection Act and other federal laws and agreements, which I'm not going to go into. So NOAA helps this partnership by collaborating on research. And this map here, this shows the study area again. It's Nome in the north, all of Norton Sound here, and it extends down to down along the Yukon River Delta. You'll notice that this doesn't go all the way down to Hooper Bay. This map here shows our aerial survey in 2017. All of the open circles here were where we sighted belugas, And you'll notice on this map that most of the beluga sightings, the highest densities, were pretty coastal. They range from about Unalakleet down to the southernmost part of our study area. And you see that there are pretty high densities of belugas even down at the southern end of our study area. So one of the things that NOAA does is it collaborates on research, such as these aerial surveys. We also assist with periodic stock assessments. And what is that? Well, it's like a health report for the stock. It says, what do we know about the abundance? What do we know about environmental factors that are affecting the stock? What do we know about human factors that are affecting the stock? So it's kind of like taking the pulse of the population. How is it doing? And NOAA also provides funding to entities like the ABWC to conduct research and to make sure that the stock is managed well. So these are some photos from the ABWC, and these are photos of NOAA, people from NOAA and the ABWC signing the co-management agreement in 1999. Now, I've used this term co-management quite a lot already, but I haven't really defined it. So what does it mean? Recently, the U.S. Marine Mammal Commission, it's a federal agency, they asked representatives from Alaska Native organizations and other federal natural resource managers what they thought co-management meant. And combined, all of these people came up with kind of a common definition of what co-management means. And I'm putting it on the screen here, and I'm going to read it for you. Co-management is a partnership based on trust and respect, established between an Alaska Native organization as defined by the Marine Mammal Protection Act and either the National Marine Fisheries Service, which is really just a part of NOAA, or Fish and Wildlife Service, with shared responsibilities for the conservation of marine mammals and their sustainable subsistence use by Alaska Natives. The three most important words in my mind in this definition are partnership, trust, and respect. Okay, so that goes into the subsistence and the management part of the story. So what about the ecology? So the ecology of belugas is pretty fascinating, and the ABWC gets a lot of credit for a lot of the research that has been done on belugas in Alaska. So this figure here shows, this is a map, and it shows the route that a beluga whale that was tagged on the 23rd of May, 2019 took between the tagging date, so May 2019, and when the tag stopped transmitting, which was the 21st of January 2020. The very first beluga whale that was ever tagged in Norton Sound was tagged by a beluga whale hunter, Tom Gray and his team. So that shows the strong commitment to understanding this population that the hunters in the area have. They want to know what's going on so that they can ensure that the population is healthy. So you'll notice that the tracks of this beluga are color coded. The yellow lines are where the beluga was during the summertime, so between the 23rd of May and the 31st of October. The red lines are the beluga's location from the 1st of September to the 31st of October. Green is where the animal was in November, purple is December, and blue is in January. And you'll notice that the beluga spent most of its summertime pretty well contained in Norton Sound and really in the southern part of the sound and along the Yukon River Delta. But then as the season progressed into autumn and winter, it went farther north, farther west, up into the Chukchi and down into the Bering Sea. So it got some mileage in over the course of those months that it was tagged. So satellite tags are one of the tools that we have in order to better understand the ecology of beluga whales. They can tell us where belugas are at any given point, what they're doing. We know this because some of the tags will tell you how deep in the water column the animals are. And if you have an idea of where the prey tend to be, you know what it might be feeding on. The rate of travel can give you an idea of whether it's cruising really quickly across the ocean, or if it's loitering in one area and maybe feeding for a while. Tags will tell us what causes belugas to stay or go. If we have information on other aspects of the environment, we can kind of piece together a story about what the whale is sensing and why it's staying where it is, or why it might be leaving. And they can also tell us where belugas might go next. And again, this requires some other contextual input about the environment, but putting the pieces together, you can get a pretty good story of the beluga's environment. And these photos here show some beluga tagging. So the photo on the left is Tom Gray's tagging team. And they were based out of Nome, Alaska. And this is a whale that was tagged on the 29th of August, 2012. And I believe this was the first beluga whale that they tagged in the Norton Sound area. And this tagging has been incredibly successful. It's been incredibly enlightening. We have learned so much from it. And the ABWC is actively working to do more tagging, to train more hunters, so that we can get more information, have a better understanding of what these whales are doing, and if any of their movement patterns or any of the habitat use might be changing as time goes on. That tagging training in the photo on the right was conducted in Stebbins, Alaska. So this map here is an example of what we have learned from the satellite tagging. This map shows the summer distribution of belugas in western and northern Alaska. It also shows a stock over here in the Gulf of Anadyr. I'm not going to talk about that at all, but I just wanted to point out that that's on the map. The 4 beluga stocks that the ABWC manages are shown here. The southernmost one is down in Bristol Bay. It's yellow. Our Norton Sound Yukon belugas, they're formally called the Eastern Bering Sea stock. And then we have the Chukchi Sea stock, who spends most of its summer up here in the Beaufort Sea and partially in the Chukchi Sea. And then lastly, the Eastern Beaufort Sea stock over here, over in the Canadian Beaufort. With belugas as a species, there are basically 2 different strategies that a stock may take in order to, in its life history. So they can either be migratory or resident. And the difference is whether they are found in different geographic locations at different times of the year. So the Cook Inlet belugas and the Bristol Bay belugas, they are resident stocks. They tend to be found in the same relatively small geographic area year round. There's some minor movements across monthly scales, but for most purposes, they're contained in a relatively small geographic area. Our Norton Sound and Yukon belugas, the Eastern Chukchi Sea belugas, and the Eastern Beaufort Sea belugas are all migratory belugas. And I'll show you that in the next slide. I'll show you what their winter distribution looks like. And those migration routes and the habitat that they tend to be found in, those we believe are things that are learned. So those are things that belugas teach other belugas. So that's part of beluga culture. This map, it uses the same color coding that I showed in the summer map, but this shows the winter distribution. That summer map I've shown here in the upper left, just for comparison. So I'm going to have you focus on this red blob right here, because those are our Eastern Bering Sea belugas that spend the summer in Norton Sound and off the Yukon. And you'll see that during winter months, they are farther south, and their distribution extends farther into the Bering Sea, farther offshore. The other thing to note with this slide is that this red blob during winter overlaps with this yellow blob, which is the winter distribution of Bristol Bay belugas, excuse me. So we know from the satellite tags that during the winter, the distribution of these two stocks overlaps, but so far we don't have any evidence that belugas from the eastern Bering Sea stock are in the exact same location at the exact same time as belugas in the Bristol Bay stock. So this separation is one of the things that helps reinforce that genetic uniqueness. That's what helps to make the eastern Bering Sea belugas, those belugas found in Norton Sound and Yukon, a unique unit. So another thing that's really interesting about belugas is they eat a wide range of prey. They have diverse tastes. This slide here focuses on some of the types of prey that have been found in stomachs of eastern Bering Sea belugas. And this is based on beluga stomachs that were collected by beluga hunters and given to scientists to pick through and to identify what prey were in their stomachs. The time period that this study was based on ranged from 1993 to 2012, and the belugas were collected in June, July, September, and October. So it's only a portion of the year, so we're only really getting a fraction of their diet, but still it's a really broad spectrum of prey. And some of the species that have been found in our eastern Bering Sea belugas include capelin, rainbow smelt, Pacific sand lance, Pacific herring, saffron cod, Arctic cod, walleye pollock, coho and chum salmon, crab, octopus, shrimp, amphipods. In total, they found at least 25 species of fish and at least 22 species of invertebrates just in this one population of belugas. The other interesting thing about the beluga diet is belugas swallow their prey whole. And so there is some individual variation in prey just based on the size of the whale. Smaller whales can't eat the larger prey because their esophagus isn't big enough. And these are some more photos that the ABWC gave to me to include in this slide. And these are actual photos of prey from beluga stomachs. So here, this photo in the top left is a hunter that is holding a beluga stomach. So that's what it looks like. We have a salmon here at the top of the slide. We see more fish bones over here. These animals here, these are isopods. They kind of look like aliens. Gosh, and the isopods that I saw on the beach off Nome and Unalakleet, they were big. They were like inches long. Another beluga stomach down here in the lower left. And this one in the center of the figure, gosh, the more you focus on it, the more you see there are some large marine snails. The scientific term for those is gastropods. Here's a crab. Here's another big snail. Here's a flatfish. So just a real diversity of prey. So why do we count them? We know that they're cool. We know that they're important for subsistence, but why do we care to count them? Well, as I mentioned earlier, having a good abundance estimate is really important to ensuring that the harvest is sustainable. And also it's an indicator of ecosystem health. If you have healthy beluga populations, then that's an indication that the ecosystem is doing well, that the prey are happy, that they're finding enough food, they're able to reproduce. So it's good to continually monitor them. So now I'll go more specifically into our aerial surveys and how we count them. These photos are all from our aerial surveys in 2022. So you see our airplane up here in the top left. It's a twin turbine Aero Commander. The figure in the bottom left is the inside of our plane, and it's from the back of the plane looking forward. So I was the data recorder in the very back of the plane. You can see my laptop computer where I enter the data. Our two pilots are at the front of the plane, and you might ask why we have two pilots on a survey like this, and that allows us to fly longer hours, longer days, and years like 2022 when the weather just wasn't good, we want to take advantage of as much daylight as we possibly can on good weather days. So That's one of the advantages to having two pilots. And then our observers are shown in the middle of the picture. There's one observer on the left hand of the plane with her head outside the window. Well, inside the plane, it's a bubble window, so she can see all the way down to the bottom, right directly under the plane. And then there's another observer looking out the right side of the plane. And this photo on the right hand side is just perfect, absolutely perfect conditions for surveying beluga whales in Norton Sound. So the type of survey that we fly, it's called a line transect survey. And I'm just going to give you some basics here because that will help you understand the results that I'm going to show a little bit later in the presentation. So the main idea is that there are these imaginary lines that we fly. We call them transects. The plane flies down the line. Some of the belugas that are out there are detected by the observers, and some of the belugas that are out there are not detected. And that's okay. That's just the rules of the game. This proportion that's not detected is really important though, because we need to understand, we need to be able to estimate what this is in order to come up with an abundance estimate. So this is where some of the more difficult math and statistics comes in. One of the important pieces of data that we collect in order to estimate that detection probability is the distance from the airplane to the belugas. So that's one of the things that goes into the analyses in order to estimate abundance. So the ABWC started conducting aerial surveys in the Norton Sound and Yukon area in 1992. And this map here shows all of the transect lines and all of the beluga sightings. The beluga sightings are the dots that were sighted during the ABWC aerial surveys between 1992 and this map here on the left goes up to 1999. So there are a couple of things I want to point out here. The first thing is that these transects, you'll see that these transects are in portions of the sound where they don't see many belugas. And that's intentional. Now, the whole idea of these aerial surveys is to cover the entire range of the population. And in order to have good confidence that you've covered the entire range of the population, for this particular study region, we want to see transect lines that are pretty empty on the far western edge and on the southern edge. That gives us some confidence that we really have identified the entire range of the population at the time of the survey. The other thing I wanted to point out about this is when the ABWC was planning their surveys in 1992, the way they found out where and when to fly was by asking the beluga hunters. They said, where do you tend to see belugas in your area and when are they there? And they were told that they tended to be seen during spring, so around May, during summer, June, July, and again during the autumn, so autumn, early winter, so November. So in 1992, the ABWC flew surveys in May, June, July, and November, and they ended up choosing June and July for all the future surveys because that was when the weather was best, the aerial survey conditions were best, and that's when they saw the most belugas. So again, that's an example of this partnership, the partnership between the scientists and the hunters exchanging information in order to understand as much as they can about this population and ensure, oh, please do not scan my computer, and ensure that the population remains healthy. Okay, so this figure on the right, it's another map of our study area. The yellow dots represent all of the beluga sightings during the aerial surveys conducted between 1995 and 2000. Now, the coloration in the water here, that comes from a satellite image. So that's what the waters looked like when viewed from space. And the thing that I want to point out here is that and for those of you who live in the region, this is no surprise to you, but the waters really close to the Yukon River Delta here, they're very muddy and murky, and that's all from the outflow from the river. The farther away you get from the river, the waters become more clear. The other thing I want to point, and these waters that are heavily influenced by the Yukon River, this is where most of the belugas are sighted during the summer months, so during June, July, and that's because they're feeding on salmon that are around the Yukon River. The other thing to point out in this map is you'll notice that there's a thin red line just offshore. That red line traces the 15-foot isobath. So everything inshore of that line is 15 feet deep or shallower, and everything offshore of that line is deeper than 15 feet. So when you look at that, most of the belugas in the area are in pretty shallow water. At least that was the case during these historical surveys from 1995 to 2000. So I will show you in an upcoming map how the distribution that we saw in 2022 compared to these historical surveys. And that's coming up soon. So where did we fly and what did we see in 2022? So this image that I've showed here, this is a similar satellite image. It's from the MODIS satellite, and it was taken on the 11th of June, 2022. So this was the clearest day that I could find in the satellite imagery that was near our survey period. We were up there from June 21st until July 3rd. We never had a day that was this clear, but we had a couple of them that came close. But the thing that I wanted to point out in this image was still you can see that really muddy water coming off the Yukon River Delta. It's pretty coastal, and there's a pretty abrupt transition. It goes from muddy to bright blue pretty quickly. And actually, we found that the water color, so how muddy the water is, that affects that detection probability, that mystery factor that I mentioned earlier, that component that's really important to estimate in order to come up with an abundance estimate. So this is the real meat of the talk if you want to know our raw results from our 2022 survey. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time explaining what we have here. So the dark blue lines that go from east to west, those are the transects that we flew. And you'll see that we got pretty good coverage, pretty uniform coverage. We extended our transects this year all the way down to Hooper Bay. So we added 8 new transects that hadn't been flown since 1992. The reason we did that was that the ABWC looked at our results from 2017 and they said, you know, those southern transects in 2017, they still had quite a few belugas on them. And remember that I said that our goal is to really survey the entire range of the population. And the fact that we had so many beluga sightings at the southern end of our 2017 survey led us to wonder if there were maybe a part of the population that was farther south that we had missed. And so that was one modification we made in 2022, just based on input from the ABWC. So those were our transect lines. That 15-meter isobath that I was talking about, that's shown in this figure by this light blue shading. So everything in the light blue is 15 feet or shallower. And so you'll see the beluga sightings are these open circles in my map here. You'll see that most of those sightings are in that shallow water. The other thing that I've done is when I've plotted these sightings, I've plotted them based on group size. So most of the belugas that we saw in 2022, they were single animals just swimming by themselves. The next most common group size that we had were pairs of belugas. In this extended part of our study area, just off Scammon Bay, that's where we saw our biggest groups in 2022. We saw one group that we estimated to have 67 beluga whales, another group that was estimated to have 87 beluga whales, and another that had 120 belugas. So pretty big group sizes down there. The last thing I wanted to point out about these sightings is this legend over here shows that the sightings are hollow circles, so just black lines around a white dot. When you look at the map, you see what looks like solid black circles. Well, that's just a function of how belugas are distributed. So I usually sit as the data recorder. If we're flying along a transect and I haven't had any action, the observers aren't seeing anything, and all of a sudden they report that they see one beluga, I know that there's a lot of belugas that are coming. They tend to be distributed like beads on a string when we're flying these surveys, so they tend to be clustered together. So the reason that some of these circles on this map look like they're solid black, that's just because we ran into belugas one right after another. It was boom, 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 and it was have to work really fast to collect the data. The greatest density of belugas, similar to all of the previous years, it was coastal, and the greatest densities during this time period were south of Unalakleet. We did get reports that belugas were sighted before we got up there in the Koyuk area and down in Hooper Bay. We didn't see them when we were flying, but chances are that those belugas might have been somewhere in the area that we actually did fly. So I'm not concerned about that. You'll notice that we didn't get as much transect coverage in this area, kind of the north central part of the sound. From an analytical perspective, and by that I mean from the perspective of getting a good abundance estimate, I'm not as concerned about that, because that's an area of the sound where we don't expect to find many beluga whales, and the effort that we did get in, we in fact did not find high densities of beluga whales. So I think that's okay. I'm not concerned about that. The reason we weren't able to fly up there was because the weather was bad. The times that we were able to get up there, it was really, really windy. It was Beaufort 5, Beaufort 6, which means, you know, huge whitecaps, and it's really hard to distinguish a beluga whale from a whitecap. So those are the main results from 2022. In total, we had 12 days that we could potentially fly. The weather was awful for 8 of those days. We were able to fly on 4 days. We flew 2 flights each day, so for a total of 8 survey flights. One flight lasts between 4 and 5 hours, so it makes for long days when we're flying 2 flights a day. We saw 272 groups of belugas for a total of 821 belugas that we got our eyes on. Only 5 calves, but that's pretty typical for these types of aerial surveys, and that's because the calves, they swim really, really close to their mothers, kind of in a streamline position. So we know that we're not detecting all the calves that are actually out there. And then I mentioned those 3 really large groups of belugas that we saw just north of Scammon Bay in that extended part of the study area. So how do our 2022 results compare to previous surveys? Because remember I said that one of the important things in conservation and management is knowing how things are changing over time. So what this table shows you is it shows you every survey that's been conducted in this region, both by ABWC and collaboratively by ABWC and NOAA. The number of belugas sighted during that survey, so that is the number of belugas that the observers got their eyeballs on, the distance flown, so this is in miles, and the study area size. Now, the easy thing here is that our study area in 2022 was larger than anything in the past. And we did that intentionally because we wanted to broaden the range in order to ensure that we were covering the entire population. Now, another thing that people are probably going to be looking at is the fact that the total number of belugas sighted in 2022 was relatively low compared to the total number that was sighted in 2017. Now, I want to make sure that you don't interpret that to mean that the abundance has changed, because the number of belugas sighted is very different from the abundance. And in order to explain that, I'm going to go back to this previous slide here. So with this type of line transect survey, the goal is not to count every single beluga in the population. We couldn't do that. We know we can't do that. And you can tell from these transects are about 7 miles apart. You can't see a beluga whale 7 miles apart. So we don't expect to count every single beluga whale out there. Our whole intention with this type of survey is to cover the study area, get relatively good uniform coverage, to get information on a proportion of the population, and then be able to use math and statistics to kind of fill in the gaps here to come up with a total abundance estimate. So on this table, I say that we saw 821 beluga whales in 2022. But if you look over here on the column next to it, on the distance flown, we only flew about half as much as we did in 2017. The more you fly, the more beluga whales you're going to see. So it all kind of equals out if you think about how far we flew. The other factor we have to consider here in order to estimate abundance is that detection probability, and that takes into account things like whether we had big whitecaps, how muddy the water was, and a few other things. So it's not the count is not directly related to the abundance, but I'm working on that. That's the next chapter in the story that I can share with you when that analysis is done. Okay, and then I think this is the last slide that I have here. And what I wanted to show you is how the information that we got from the satellite tags that the hunters in Norton Sound placed on belugas compares to the distribution of belugas that we saw in June of 2022. So this map on the far right shows our survey results from 2022. This map in the middle shows that first map that I showed you, the beluga whale that Tom Gray's team tagged in 2019. And in the thick black box, this is basically our study area for 2022. And then this map on the far left, this is another whale that Tom's team tagged. It was tagged on the 9th of November 2016, but what is shown here is that animal's path between the 25th of June and the 5th of July in 2017. So about the same time period that we were flying our surveys in 2022. And the thing that you'll notice is that the tagged animals were basically in the same area where we saw the highest densities of belugas in 2022. So there's been some very, very good consistency in habitat use across these years. So I'd like to finish off with acknowledgements because this was definitely a team effort. I'd like to thank our beluga observers who helped me out in the field this year, our pilots, the ABWC Executive Committee who've provided support both for our 2022 surveys and for all the previous aerial surveys, my colleagues in NOAA who helped get the funding and make sure the contracts went through, and last but not least to Lloyd Lowry and Doug DeMaster for their pioneering efforts in conducting aerial surveys for belugas in the region. And at this point, I'm happy to open it up for any questions or comments you may have. If you've noticed anything different with your belugas when you've been out, I'd love to hear it. Basically, we can open it up for discussion now.
All right. Well, thank you, Megan. And that was awesome. That was the nicest understanding of how a survey is done. Honestly, you already have a question. Hang on one second, Charlie. And while everyone's thinking of their question, let's show Megan some love in the chat box. It is never easy to be the public speaker. It's always fun to watch, but it's always kind of a little nerve-wracking to be the one on point, honestly. So toss some love in there for Megan for giving us the information. And I also want to give a shout out to the Alaska Beluga Whale Commission because obviously you guys work closely together, and that it looks like a really great partnership. So really appreciate that energy there. With that, you can also put questions in the chat box. And first I'm going to say, because we have a caller still on the line that's made it all the way through, if that caller, and I'll get to you, Charlie, but callers get priority at Straight Science. If that caller has a question, feel free to unmute and ask your question now or whenever you feel the urge. and we will get to you. All right. Given that, Charlene, ask your question.
Yeah, that is just all kinds of questions, but I'll try to limit myself. I really liked your talk. So I flew an awful lot of herring surveys, 10, 20 years ago, from basically 1980 to 2000. And what we saw, our surveys were a month ahead of yours. So we flew a lot starting in mid-May to mid-June. And as the herring run ran down and the spawned out fish were massing in loose schools to leave, that's when we saw all the beluga. And very often we saw big bunches up by Shaktoolik and along southern Norton Sound where the herring were cycling out into the deeper water. So I guess one idea I had listening to your talk is you're focused on a time when pink salmon and chum salmon are present, and that must be what go up the Yukon and therefore entice the whales there. But I think they'd probably follow any large biomass if they could. And another question I had was that the historic beluga whaling sites that I'm aware of are at Klickitat, Buckland, Sasolik, places where it was very shallow and hunters could drive the whales into shallow water to harvest them. And it's been said to me that beluga whale are kind of a maternal lineage, and that I know several guys that told me, well, we killed too many of the females, and now they don't go back there anymore. So I wondered if you put any credence in that.
Are you talking up at Charlie? This is Gay. Are you talking about Buckland area, Kotzebue Sound?
Sounds like it.
Talking about Sasolik in particular, but I think Klickitat as well. Klickitat,
okay.
Which is in Norton Sound.
All right.
Yeah. So we're looking into that, the Kotzebue belugas. That's a separate. Well, Kotzebue was an interesting situation up there. There's definitely genetic evidence that at one point there was a unique, genetically distinct population in Kotzebue Sound. The question is whether that genetically distinct group is still there, and that's actually something that our agency is looking into with our co-management partners and with the genetic scientists that have done the work. So those are different belugas than what we're talking about here that spend the summer in Norton Sound and off the Yukon. But it's true that the belugas that used to spend summers in the Kotzebue Sound area in great numbers, they have not come back in great numbers like they did in the past. That's one of the reasons why it's so important to continue to do the monitoring, to understand what's going on in the Norton Sound and Yukon area is so that we can make sure that the harvest is sustainable, make sure we understand what's going on in the environment, so that the belugas stick around. And what you said about the beluga's ability to change prey depending on what is most abundant, that's 100% true. And the slide that I showed that showed the different prey types, now there's a sample bias for the seasons in which the beluga whales were hunted that we examined the stomachs from. So remember I said that those stomachs only came from June, July, September, and October. So those are only 4 months out of 12 months of the year, and belugas eat year round. So there's a big portion of the diet that we don't have much information on based on stomach contents. But I think you're exactly right that they're going where the prey are. They're very flexible in what they can eat, and they're going to do whatever is energetically the best thing for them to do to keep going.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Charlie. Any other questions? I always mute myself. Go ahead, Rob.
Oh, my camera's off. I'll
Your
say hello
camera is
so
off.
you can, yeah, put my face. Yeah.
There you go.
Hello. Great
Good.
presentation, Megan. Thank you. You explained so many things so clearly. Excellent. I guess my question, so maybe two, and I'll look at my notes here very quickly. So double observer method. So the aerial surveys, are you using? Yeah. Anyways, you explained that very well. But I was wondering, double observer, are you doing that? And then the second question, with regard to the diet, are you any stable isotope work being done, or how that might work and inform kind of that out of the season of harvest, that you can get stomach samples and what they're consuming and inform, you know, what they are eating? And do you think they're eating a lot of euphausids perhaps in the off season? That kind of thing. Thanks.
Yeah, I think euphausids was on the list. So the invertebrates that have been found in Eastern Bering Sea salmon include shrimp, polychaetes, isopods, bivalves, echidnas, amphipods, mysids, crabs, tunicates, gastropods, cephalopods, and bryozoans. So euphausids weren't in the list for this particular stock that were identified, but you know, they're so flexible in what they eat. My guess is that if they encountered a swarm of euphausids, they would eat it, given everything else they eat. I mean, they eat tunicates. And one of the reasons that I didn't put all of those species on my slides is because I didn't have a nice little picture for a tunicate or for mysids. So my guess is that, yeah, they probably are eating euphausids. Now, your question about double observer, let me explain what you mean by that. Our surveys, the photos that I showed you, I had one team of observers. So I had one person looking out the right and one person looking out the left of the airplane. Double observer methods, that uses two independent teams of observers. And I use the term observer loosely. So that could be two independent teams of humans, or it could be one team of humans and one camera, or anything else that you could use to detect that there's a beluga under you. We used those double observer methods on our marine mammal surveys, our cetacean surveys that we flew in the Beaufort Sea and the Chukchi Sea in 2018 and 2019. And the data that we collected from that gives us an estimate of transect detection probability, which is if there's a beluga that is at the surface available to be seen really close to the plane, what is the probability that an observer is actually going to detect it? So we have those data from the surveys farther north. We contemplated collecting more of those data this year. The reason we didn't, there's a couple of reasons. One is that the data from the Beaufort and Chukchi Sea that we did comb through, the photographic data, it takes a really long time for a human to go through that. So in order to make that an efficient process and something that we can do continuously, we need to work on developing auto detectors for them so that a computer can find the images. The other thing is that we aren't completely convinced that the camera setup that we had was the most efficient. Our camera setup was optimized for bowhead whales, which is a much bigger target. When we're talking about the beluga whales in the Norton Sound region, the highest density whales are in that really muddy water. So I think we probably would have needed to put some more effort into a different camera system. The last thing about it is one of the key pieces of data that you need in order to make those double observer methods work is you need to know whether Team A detected the same sighting that Team B detected. And as I mentioned before, belugas, when we find them both in the Beaufort Sea and down in Norton Sound, it's like beads on a string, and it's just boom, boom, boom. And it was really hard for us to tell by comparing the human observer sightings to the imagery sightings, what sightings were matches between the two independent teams. So this is definitely an active area of investigation. And I'd say that my NOAA lab and the ABWC are working on this pretty hard. The other thing that we've been talking to the ABWC about is how to get a better handle on that calf detection probability. So remember that I said that in 2022, we only saw 5 calves, and we know that there were more than 5 calves out there. So how can we better estimate what proportion of the calves we're missing? One of the ideas we've had, yes, imagery from the manned aircraft is potentially one way of doing that, or maybe using drones. And so doing focal follows and looking to see what proportion, follow an animal for a while, in a way that's not disturbing its behavior, and see what proportion of the time a calf is visible, and that would help us get at that calf detection probability. So that's a little bit more than you asked, but yeah, those are the best answers that I have for you.
Yeah, no, that's great. And yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're looking at the population, the young versus the immatures versus the adults, my last thought was, or question, maybe it's a comment. So you mentioned that 15 feet, that's the level of water that you were detecting the majority of belugas foraging in. Yeah, that's makes sense, doesn't it? In terms of, you know, are they, well, I'm actually I'm a seabird person. So how deep do they dive? And 15 feet, I mean, that's, I guess if you get offshore, how far offshore do you get that it exceeds, you know, maybe to 30 feet? And that's where they drop off, and detections of beluga whales will drop off.
Well, so I should clarify that 15 feet was the depth of the depth from the depth of the ocean bottom. So basically they were foraging in water where the ocean bottom was 15 feet deep. We were detecting them right at the surface, and there was what looked to be feeding activity right at the surface. So where in the water column they are feeding, that's another question, and that's going to correspond to where in the water column the salmon are, or whatever prey is that they're feeding on. My guess is that the salmon are just really piling up inside of that 15-foot isobath, and so that's where the belugas are piling up. Now the satellite tag data, there are some satellite tag data that give depth information, and I'm pretty sure, and those are for actually Tom would know better than me. I don't know if they've put dive tag data on belugas in Norton Sound. Well, actually, I do know the answer to that. They have. They've also put dive tag data on belugas that have gone up into the Beaufort and the Chukchi. And again, habitat is really important when you're looking at where in the water column they're foraging, because I know that up in the Beaufort they're foraging deeper in the water column because they're targeting like Arctic cod, which are over the continental, over the slope and in deeper waters. So the depth of foraging depends on where it is that they're feeding and what they're feeding on.
Oh, thank you. Great.
Yeah, and
Excellent.
Rob, yeah, it is excellent response, Megan. Thank you. And good question, Rob. And just know, Rob, that I know you're seabirds, but belugas are kind of an amazing all-purpose whale. I mean, they can dive to several hundred feet, and then they can end up in Fairbanks, right? They go right on up the river, not afraid to get in that muddy water and follow those king salmon right on up. So they're a really amazing animal.
Yeah, and Jay, that's a good
I
point.
heart belugas.
There we go. Yeah.
That's a good point, Gay. The hunters have told us this before, and actually we got some reports from hunters when we were in the field this year that the belugas were going up the river. And so that is a known source. That will result in our estimate being an underestimate because we do not survey up the rivers. We don't have a good way of surveying up the rivers, so we don't get that proportion of the population. Our assumption is that it's a relatively small proportion of the population, but when these abundance estimates come out, we explicitly say that this estimate does not include belugas that were up the rivers at the time that we were surveying.
Secretly, I've always thought it might be a nice thing to drop a hydrophone in Fairbanks and just let it sit all the bottom and wait to see who comes. If not, that's pretty extreme. I mean, I've heard belugas going all the way up to Fort Yukon, Tanacross, places like that. But just to see who does kind of come up the river. I mean, I think they'd be clicking like crazy because the water is so, there's so much turbidity. It's so muddy.
Yeah.
But anyway, you have a night, sorry, any other questions, Rob?
Well, yeah, lots, but I'll let other people ask.
All right, we can come back around. There is in the chat box, Marvin Otkikun says, great report, Megan. Last month, there were reports of beluga about 25 to 30 miles up the Yukon. There you go, from Emonic chasing salmon. Also a handful that were 4 miles above Kotlik doing the same thing.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Marvin. Yeah, exactly. And I'm glad to get those reports. I really like getting those reports because it gives me an idea of what we're potentially missing. Yeah.
Awesome. And
Rob, I never answered your question about the stable isotope stuff. And I'm going to plead ignorance there. That diet stuff is not really my focus, and so I don't have a good answer for that. But maybe someone from the who's on from the ABWC knows if there's been some stable isotope work, or I can look into it and I can get back to you if you want to send me an email, and I can get back to you on that.
Yeah, no, I was just curious, and then of course fatty acids would be the other piece.
Yeah.
Might get some. But yeah,
right. I'm just glad that belugas are such a diverse feeder because, you know, we've had a big switch here in the northern Bering Sea with the breakdown of the thermal barrier and the southern Bering Sea ecosystem kind of rolling on into the northern Bering Sea ecosystem and shifting things up. So I'm glad they're pretty adaptable. It seems like so. Any other questions, reports, comments for Megan? All right, so it sounds like from the survey work, it's not too the numbers were down, but nothing really extraordinary there. You know,
I wouldn't even say that the numbers were down. I would say that we didn't get as much effort in because the weather was bad.
Yeah.
I'm still working up the numbers.
Okay.
But you know, the encounter rates, which is the number of belugas per kilometer flown, was relatively similar. But that's not the whole story. We need to work on the estimates. So yeah,
sounds good. Sounds like maybe we can get you back with the final when all the math is done.
There you go. Yeah.
And then the last question is, when do you come back? Not only would we be interested to hear what the final is, but when does the survey come back? That's what I was interested in. When do we see you again? After
you know, I think my pay grade is a little too low to answer that. So
all right.
It's a great question though.
Yeah. So maybe they'll be listening in and on the recording. Yeah, it'd be great.
Yeah.
With that, now, any other questions, comments, chats? All right. Well, we want to thank Megan Ferguson for such a nice job. And also, again, to the Alaska Beluga Whale Committee. I think I see some members here, so that's really great. And thank you for tuning in. Next week is kind of a NOAA. We're having a 1-2 NOAA punch. Megan's breaking trail for next Thursday. Straight Science is going to go live. So we are actually going to meet in the Grand Hall for those of you in Nome. We will be doing hybrid. So we're going to try to do something we've never done before, and that's be doing it live and virtually. So you can join any which way you'd like. And the speaker will be Dr. Richard Spinrad. He is the Undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere and NOAA's top administrator. So I'll probably be wearing a fancier shirt than tonight, Megan, for you.
That's
And I'll
okay.
be live, and we'll be live live at the Grand Hall at 6:30. It should be very interesting. His topic will be, and we're very interested to hear, topic will be the Arctic goals, NOAA's Arctic goals. So that'll be something and to definitely tune in for. And we're glad, Megan, you sort of softened the way for Dr. Spinrad with giving us the good report you did on Norton Sound belugas. Very much appreciated. And you're getting lots of good kudos. Thank you to the Straight Science crowd. You guys are always very, very understanding of how much effort it takes to be a speaker. So we really appreciate that. Look at that. You're getting some claps. That's nice.
Nice.
All right. With that, we'll say good night.